I know, a few I don't, but those of you who don't know me, hi. And the story tonight is going to be very personalized. And I guess part of that is because, you know, RISC has been very much part of my life for over 30 years now, but also to newcomers. So people who have only been 15, 20 years maybe, it's just to show how you can contribute to an organization like RISC, and also what it offers and how it can extend and contribute to the richness in your own life. And that's certainly true in my case. So hopefully I can share my screen and you can see some pretty pictures. You need to see if you can spot yourself, because quite a few of you will be in these. Okay, just to reiterate, I'll be sort of developing some of the things that Martin flagged up, and just as a reminder, I was just thinking about what are the kind of things that over the past 30 years that might just show you what RISC's values are, and also the kind of continuity over that long period. And I was thinking of some of the catchphrases that might sort of convey that. And so here are some of them. Martin already mentioned solidarity rather than charity, but others are Southern voices, giving a platform to unheard voices, and then linked with that sort of hidden history. So it's very much sort of looking at aspects of society, aspects of history that have been neglected and unheard, and RISC providing a platform for those. And then another really key one is think global, but that act local. That's really been important. And then the other one is how we not only raise awareness, we have that kind of educational role of changing attitudes, but then a key element is that we're trying to get people to actually take action, that we want people to make a difference and do things. And I think that's a critical element of what RISC has been about, and I'm sure others of you will think of others. And I just want to put things, the beginnings of RISC that Martin talked about, into a wider context, because it didn't just come out of nowhere. And back in the mid-80s, when World Education Branch or RISC sort of took off, Reagan, it's the world of Reagan and Thatcher, of the Cold War, and cruise missiles, American cruise missiles being introduced as part of sort of Reagan's sort of strategy locally at Greenham Common. And so those of you who are old enough may remember the women's demonstrations around the perimeter. And a lot of those RISCies, the early RISCies, were involved in the whole Greenham movement, and one where women particularly were sort of discovering their sort of political, in a wider context, their political power. It's also a time when AIDS was beginning to really take off, as some of you may have seen in the It's a Sin series on Channel 4 recently. And it was just a few years after some of the notorious riots all around the country. That top one is in Brixton, where the confrontation between the police, the state, and Black communities was really beginning to ferment and take off, and just an uprising really happening all over the country. And what's really interesting is with the Black Lives Matter, how, what doesn't change. There's also a time when Section 28, so this was where the Thatcher government introduced laws where you weren't allowed to corrupt young minds, particularly in schools, by even raising the issue around sexuality. And so there was a big campaign against this sort of government policy. And then particularly around risk, one of the really important things was the whole Live Aid, the whole Band-Aid era, and which was very much pushing that kind of charity model of development that Martin was talking about. So RISC was very much in opposition to and a response of individuals to all these sort of things that were going around. And then on the kind of a more sort of positive sort of aspect, we have other kind of things that were part of the mix. So we have Small is Beautiful, so a really, really key book, which was just looking at questioning the capitalist mode of production of constant growth, and just sort of realizing what some of the limits to growth could be. It's also a time when fair trade is beginning to take off. And those of us who will remember when RISC first moved to Reading, fair trade coffee required a lot of solidarity to drink. It was absolutely disgusting. It was from Nicaragua. And so to do our bit to support the Nicaraguan revolution, you had to drink this awful, awful stuff. Luckily, fair trade has come on a long way since then. And RISC and the World Shop have been part of that. It was also a time when there were still liberation struggles going on. It was part of the global, Cold War. And so both in Nicaragua, there are Sandinistas, and then in Zimbabwe, those kind of liberation struggles against the vestiges of colonialism were still really, really important. And then another kind of positive thing was how permaculture was beginning to take off. It was arriving from the US and from Australia into Britain. So that's just a bit of a context in which Web RISC sort of took off. The famous bus that some of you will have heard of. And I'd like to draw your attention to some of these dodgy looking characters in duffel coats. This really was the mid-80s, and particularly the third from the left. This was Colin in his prime, and Anne Yarwood, who Martin mentioned there on the first left. So she was the real force for making World Education Berkshire a reality. And you may recognize some other people here in their prime. And also, a lot of those people who are at this workshop, they are some of the, the first iteration, the first people involved in RISC. And you might recognize some of the faces there. And this is a workshop where the black members of the group were doing a role play around slavery. And it was a time when all these kinds of issues were coming together, and there were some very vigorous debates within the team about what the important issues were, and obviously people bringing their own priorities, people bringing their own agendas to the table. So just to kind of crystallize a bit about RISC's work, and you may recognize this photograph, some of the characters in this photograph that I've chosen to illustrate sort of community. So RISC's mission is to raise awareness about these global issues, and the sort of two areas are in the formal education sector, which is in some ways the low-hanging fruit, because here you've got teachers, you've got kids who are a captive audience, yeah? And so the challenge there is, how do you get teachers to take on board these global issues in their training in their teaching around the curriculum? So that was one of the major elements of RISC's formal education work. And this is something that Ruth, Abba and Manju are going to be dealing with in greater detail at a later date. But a lot of the work that, say, I was involved in is creating some of these teaching resources for our education work. But then also, and something which really makes RISC stand out from a lot of the other centres that were being set up at the same kind of time, was that we had a big focus on working in the community. And this is something that Benta was very instrumental in, and then this has been taken over by Zainab. So you can see there some of the areas of work that we're involved in, which have a more of a sort of community sort of element. So there's obviously the World Shop, the cafe, and now latterly the roof garden, and then also the events. And then another baby that both Martin and Benta were involved in is Reading International Forum, and then more recently Food for Families. So these are the more sort of community oriented sort of side of what we're doing. So in the 80s, the whole issue of the media, of media representation, and how the popular media helps to perpetuate all kinds of stereotypes. It helps to perpetuate oppression in lots of different kinds of ways. And so, for example, we have, the Cosmopolitan, the kind of women's magazine, how concepts of, gender, sexuality are sort of reproduced through those magazines. We also then have, the exotic sort of other, the anthropological sort of images that were in colour supplements and coffee table books, that kind of thing. And then to contrast with that is the kind of images of the global south, which is of poverty, of hunger, and this kind of cliche that a lot of the agencies, even people like Oxfam, were using in order to pull at people's heartstrings. And Band-Aid, Live Aid was very much part of this, how you can be the sort of the savior, the white savior of the poverty-stricken Africa, or the so-called, third world. And so this was the kind of agenda that was coming out of those early days around RISC's bus project. That images were a key element. And so Anne managed to get our first EU funding for an images project. And this was advertised in The Guardian. And at that time, you may recognize this dodgy looking geezer. I'd been working in Bristol. I did a PGCE, so I trained in infants, and I was working with unemployed youth in city farms. So it was beginnings of the city farm movement at the end of the 70s. And I was also at the same time during the 80s, the same time that web was taking off, was part of a BAME cultural group called RED, Revolutionary Education Development. And so basically we were sort of troublemakers, sort of lefty pinkos, and doing all kinds of work, particularly around culture, working with groups like African Dawn, which was a Pan-African cultural group that was very much sort of liked by the alternative sort of politicos of the time. And we were producing our own sort of stories using images. I had visited Burkina Faso in West Africa to try to make a record of the amazing things that were happening as part of the revolution that was taking place there. We had materials from Angola, just sort of looking at the way that Portuguese colonialism had impacted on Angola. And then also we had a large number of people from Pakistan who were keen on just examining the history of empire, and particularly what's called in the history books, what Boris Johnson would call the Indian Mutiny, that was called the 1857 War of Indian Independence by people in India. And so we were producing these tape slides, because you've got to remember that this was the day before, the days before PowerPoints. This was the day when one of the materials, our audiovisual materials we used, were slides. And so we produced tape slideshows. We're really talking about archaeology here in terms of kind of the technology which we used. And because I was fancy free, no children, I could indulge my passion for traveling. I worked as a photojournalist, and so worked in Burkina Faso, but also in Nepal, where I hooked up with people who were working around human rights and for democracy in that country before. So this was in the late 1980s, and so I was working with students who were raising awareness about the plight of child labour in Nepal. And so this is all the kind of things that I was bringing to the table when I successfully applied through an advert in The Guardian to join this images project that RISC had. And we call the project Focus of Change, and it was very much using deconstructing media images around race, gender and class, and encouraging teachers to take this on board. And so we spent 3 years training activities, taking them out into schools, seeing what would work, getting feedback from children and from teachers, and then producing this photo pack, which included 24 A4 sized images. And a key element was to try to give people, some of the oppressed minorities, some kind of control over the images that were being used to represent them. And so we were finding images produced by Black BAME photographers, by women photographers. And so this was, very, very sort of typical of the sort of work which RISC was getting into, and the theme of questioning images, questioning the use of images has been key to a lot of the work that we were doing. And also I had opportunities through RISC because we were organising events for all kinds of people from the global south. And so I was able to make contacts with them and was invited on a number of occasions to work as a photojournalist in different countries around the world. So one in particular was in the Philippines, where there were lots of struggles of indigenous people around both land rights, but also around mining, so open cast mining. So I spent 6 months in the Philippines, sort of taking photographs, which would then feed back into solidarity movements, Filipino-based solidarity movements here in the UK. And so we had a number of collaborations with the Philippine Resource Centre and for Philippine Indigenous Peoples Links. These were two Philippines organisations that RISC partnered up with as a result of this link. And we also then produced a number of teaching resources. We had exposure in New Internationalists using some of my photographs around the whole issue of mining, and then linked up with communities in South Wales who had exactly the same kind of issues around open cast coal mining, and were trying to resist international corporations, mining corporations, who were wanting to bring a similar kind of landscape to South Wales as the Philippines on indigenous people's land. So you can see how building those kind of bridges, looking at the convergence between the kind of oppression, the kind of forces that people in this country and the ways in which they were similar with the kind of struggles in global south, the kind of parallels, was a key element of the messages that RISC was trying to do in its work. As a result of my travels, I was invited to go and work in Goa, where local groups were trying to resist five-star tourism. So these were multinational companies who are trying to bring five-star tourism to the coast, displacing sort of fishing communities. And then in the Philippines, tourism was another issue which was being highlighted, where golf tourism, using indigenous people's land, was also part of the ways in which corporations were moving in on local people's rights. And so again, this is other sort of themes that were coming out of these experiences. Working around tourism, bringing that into the curriculum, particularly, say, in geography, and then also producing exhibitions with Nepal-based, this organization, Child Workers in Nepal, just bringing people's attention in this country to, for example, how child labor was impacting on young people in Nepal, depriving them of their rights. And so we helped to set up this solidarity group called Nepal Watch here in Reading, and produce this sort of magazine. And then a lot of the material that I collected was then fed into other projects that we were working on. So at the time, and this was something that Bente in particular was working on, so the whole issue of trade, ways in which international agencies like the World Bank and IMF and their kind of policies that were being imposed on the global South, how they were increasing the poverty, that these were all issues that we wanted to raise awareness about. And so exhibitions was one of the media that we used. And so this was an exhibition and a teaching pack around trade. And because of our links with other European partners, particularly through organizations in Italy, some of our materials were translated into Italian or into French. So this just illustrates again how, you know, we were part of a sort of a European movement. We were feeding on the whole sort of zeitgeist of solidarity right way across Europe. And then sort of taking advantage of, you know, what was happening locally, that some of you may remember WOMAD, so the world of music, arts and dance, which was sort of bringing world music to the UK, really taking off. And I can't remember when, sometime in the 80s, it ended up in Rivermead. And so from one table in the actual Rivermead Centre where RISC had a stall, it then grew, mainly through Bente's work with the International Forum, into a really, really ambitious tent that we had, all kinds of speakers, exhibitions around world music, teaching packs around world music, because we had this archive of photographs that I'd taken during WOMAD. And Bente will talk more about this kind of work with the International Forum next week. Other link-ups, other partnerships were with Baby Milk Action. So those of you who may be aware of the whole campaign against Nestle and baby milk, and how this was helping to reinforce malnutrition amongst babies in the global South, that we teamed up with them using our expertise around, you know, looking at the media, questioning media images. And so the result was this teaching pack, which was disseminated by Baby Milk Action, which was sort of deconstructing the sort of advertising, the sort of messages that the likes of Nestle were coming out with in order to try to address the issues that were being raised by this international campaign against baby milk. Another partnership was with Banana Link. So this was an NGO based, similar to RISC, that was based in Norwich, and that they were very much linking with trades unions around banana production in both the Caribbean and in other parts of the world. And so we brought our own expertise of producing exhibitions and teaching packs to the party. And so here we have Growing Bananas, which is a teaching resource that we produce. And then this exhibition, The Cost of Bananas, that was disseminated around the UK. And here are just very, very quickly, as we're running out of time, here's some of the other sort of projects that we were involved in that will give you a sort of flavour of the sort of troublemaking that we were doing, that we were very diverse, that we prided ourselves at being ahead of the curve of for example, you know, when before RISC was addressing this issue, development education, and it was not seen that raising the issue of sexuality was anything to do with development education. And so we were very much pushing the envelope, and the same with sort of looking at gender roles. And here's a few more of the resources that we're producing. Just very, very quickly, this is, because Bente won't be showing you any of these, so she'll have some of the posters which she has behind her, but she won't be sort of showing you in detail of some of the work that she was involved in, exhibition around women's, the ignoring of women's contribution to economies, and then also particularly around sort of fair trade, making Reading a fair trade town. This is another exhibition which we're involved in, and this again sort of just reinforces a link with an Italian organisation that commissioned cartoonists from the Global South to reflect on, you know, their relationship between North and South. And so we translated this into English, and then that was another exhibition which we distributed. I then also got involved in creating a map which illustrated Reading's links with the rest of the world, going way, way back to the 7th century. So this was researching how globalization is nothing new, that people and ideas and materials had come to Reading and vice versa, you know, throughout history. So just to draw your attention to, at the top, that's Caversham Park. So this, you know, becomes the BBC Centre, and that is the place where the first recorded, well, that I could find anyway, first recorded black person in Reading, who a black servant, because the local paper, the Reading Mercury, was complaining about all these exotic people from India and Africa were turning up as servants in the local country house. So very, very quickly, just touching on this, Reading Slave Links. This was another exhibition. Bente will talk more about this next week. And then this leads to a more recent development of that, where we sort of updated the links and created this map, just ways in which you could go around Reading and just sort of trace the footsteps of the links that Reading has to slavery, and also places in which are associated with Reading's black history. And then more recently, sorry we're running on a bit, but this was also an important thread of our work, again building on our expertise and in creating exhibitions, but also then with a Dutch partner. So this was a similar organisation in Nijmegen who had European funding to look at Islamophobia in Britain. And the product of this was a teaching pack, Challenging Islamophobia, and an exhibition which is available online and also as a hard copy, which just looked at the long history of Islam in Britain. And again, it's that sort of element that I talked to right at the beginning about looking at hidden histories, that most people would think that most Muslims came, you know, and that Islam came to these shores, you know, in the 60s and 70s. And the whole sort of idea peddled by the media that Islam and Muslims are a problem. And so this was an exhibition which celebrated the role that Islam and Muslims have in the country. We'll pick that up later. Right, very, very quickly, I'm sorry, some of you are going to be missing Omni Connect, which is on at 8 o'clock, but hopefully I won't go on too much longer. So we're now talking to a whole other area, and you can see that this kind of brings back my experience in city farms in Bristol way back in the 70s, and the opportunity that we had because of a problem, i.e. a leaking roof. And you can see here how this was very much sort of driven by Martin, the crazy idea of creating an outdoor classroom, creating a garden on the roof, the leaking roof above the meeting hall. And you can see the transformation that took place just over 8 years of how this was transformed into this edible forest by volunteers. And although this was intended as a way of just sort of reinforcing all RISC's work around food, around sustainability, that we never imagined it would become such an important part of what we're doing, the kind of unintended consequences that you can't get from a meeting of strategic planning. Nobody would have thought that there would be all these opportunities, which I'm going to be exploring now, coming out of this lunatic idea of trying to get some money to fix our roof using the lottery. And yeah, I think one of the most bizarre sort of elements of the kind of attention that the roof garden attracted was, you can see there on the bottom right, that a Russian TV crew came to visit the garden because they were doing a story that was prompted by Boris Johnson as Mayor of London, saying that for the 2012 Olympics, Britain was going to be serving British champagne to visitors to London. And so this Russian TV crew somehow came to the roof garden to film their slot about Boris's sort of statement. And we discovered ways in which we could use the garden to raise awareness about what sustainability is. That we started doing workshops, we started opening the gardens up as part of the National Garden Scheme to the public. And so every year we would have over 400 people visiting the garden. It's a whole way which we could reach new audiences about what does sustainability mean? What can you do in your own garden to make it more sustainable? As well as a way in which we could run workshops for teachers, as well as hosting visits in order to really raise these kind of agendas about food. And a whole, here are just a few of the books which feature the roof garden. And the one that I really like is this one, 1001 Gardens You Must See Before You Die. So those of you who've been to the roof garden, you can tick off one of those gardens on your bucket list by coming out to our next in-person open day, which who knows when that's going to be. And then another spin-off, again, which was unintended, was the School Global Gardens project. So this was, we got some money from DFID to just promote, because loads of schools had their own school gardens, but they weren't really bringing out sort of the global dimension. They weren't looking at ways in which you could use your school garden to raise awareness about food, global food sovereignty around the world. And so we started this off until the funding was cut by the incoming Tory government. So here are just a few of the things. And so now we're coming to the really exciting bit. I think that, the real RISC sort of growth area. A lot of people were interested in the roof garden, and this fund from the lottery came available, which was encouraging local food production. And so Paul Harper, who at that time was a trustee, and I sort of put together this application that was to create, I think at the time it was 10 school and community gardens around Reading, using school grounds, using bits of land. And this is the origins of a lot of you here, the Food for Families team. This is the origins of the project. So another really, really crazy idea that has just taken off because the landscape, the climate is ready for it, because people are increasingly interested in this whole idea of sustainable food, both gardening for well-being, but also for sustainability. How can we make our own lives more sustainable. And so it's very much about transformations. And so very, very quickly, this is the site over in Southcote, a transformation of an area which was a problem for the council because of tipping, and how this is then turned into a resource for the whole community. And that's probably sort of one of our most successful gardens, where there's a local group of people are managing it, doing their own fundraising. And basically, they've hived off, they've become their own sort of a little group. And then more recently, this is behind St. Luke's Church Hall off Early Road. So this is, again, the transformation using conservation volunteers to clear the site, and then the creation of this little oasis in East Reading, the basis of all kinds of stuff for the local community, the local schools, Redland School also being involved. And that's something which Naomi has really sort of taken on board, and it's become autonomous in many, many ways. And then I guess the most recently sort of landmark project is how the way that we've transformed that big hole left by the demolition of the civic offices into a meanwhile garden. So this is going to be redeveloped. That there is no way that Reading Borough Council, cash strapped, is not going to sell this on for redevelopment. But in the meantime, we've transformed it into this green lung, right at the centre of Reading. And here you can see how various partners have come together. You can see Willem, one of our trustees there, sort of bringing his corporate team as part of a team building exercise to help out. We've got kids from the local Muslim Montessori school. They designed a herb garden based on Islamic themes, and they they designed and then built this garden. We had the Nepalese Gurkhas, so retired Gurkha veterans who have their community centre just 100 metres from the garden, that they've taken over 40 plots on the site. And then more recently, down at the bottom left, you can see how the most recent development has been increasing the area during COVID, using COVID responder volunteers to increase the amount of produce which is produced, and then contributing that to a new project, Veg for Reading. So contributing that to food banks, local food banks who are distributing the food to needy people, needy families, and then also to organisations who are producing prepared meals for local vulnerable people, such as refugees and volunteers. And then the latest very, very exciting project is in East Reading, the new Aisha Mosque. This is an old corporate building which has been converted into a mosque. And so this is a very, very outward going group there, big Islamic gardens. And I know Shaheen, who's involved in that, is on the call. This is very, very exciting because it's ways of going beyond the local Muslim community and building bridges, building community resilience in East Reading and beyond. So bringing all the other sort of examples which you've seen of community gardens and bringing them to East Reading. Town meal, very, very quickly, just another exciting way in which we've raised awareness in Reading of local food, encouraging people to eat and grow local food. And then this is the Veg for Reading project, which I mentioned earlier. And then this is the latest thing. So this is some volunteers who designed a global garden during lockdown and are planting that up. And this just ties into a project which we're doing with the Open University. So this is Beth, who's the gardener at Lavender Place. This is a project where we're using smart technology. We're using tablets and smartphones to get people who've been involved in the community gardening over COVID, to get them to record their experiences, their testimony about how growing food during lockdown has helped to benefit both their health and also their well-being. And then this will be edited into YouTube videos to encourage other people to do the same, to be a kind of a case study of how we can take community food growing forward and encourage people to sort of follow in our footsteps. Very, very quickly, carbon neutral gardening exhibition, if anybody's interested in downloading this or using the exhibition, just sort of raising awareness about what does sustainable planet-friendly food look like and what you can do to promote it. And then some of the other ways in which we've taken the food issue to just sort of reach new audiences. So these are some of the new initiatives where we're partnering up with sort of FE provision within Reading to just bring new audiences to the party. And I guess one of the messages, and something which kind of, as we kind of trace, you know, some of the faces, some of the, you know, the different sort of stages of RISC story, that the key element is people. And I think, you know, you've seen some of these people, some of them are in this slide, that without people, that RISC wouldn't have achieved so much that it has in becoming part of RISC's fabric. And I think the message for all of you, whether it's trustees or volunteers or staff, is that, you know, you can all bring something of yourself to the organisation, that you can all make your contribution, and that together, you know, with RISC as a kind of a medium, as a framework, we can all do our bit for creating a better future, that we can all be part of the difference. And hopefully, you know, that something of that message has come through in this overextended presentation. And Spencer and then the education team will develop some of these ideas a bit more in the following weeks. Okay, thank you. Sorry for I always do this. Sorry for overextending my welcome.